Visitors to Rocky Ridge Farm enter the Wilders farmhouse through the kitchen, and this is their first view of the home where Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote the last 5 books in the Little House series: By the Shores of Silver Lake, The Long Winter, Little Town on the Prairie, These Happy Golden Years, and The First 4 Years, a novel that Wilder never sought to publish during her lifetime and was published after her death. This book was also written in this house. Part 2 of Laura Ingalls Wilder Exploring Her Work and Writing Life will examine these books along with Rose Wilder Lane's novel Let the Hurricane Roar, also known now as Young Pioneers. That book was also written in this house. When I first visited Rocky Ridge Farm in the 1960s, I too came through the kitchen door. But in those days, Wilder's original manuscripts were on display here in glass cabinets. I was 11 years old and came away from that first visit struck by 2 things. First, the physical act of writing, the reality of it. I don't know exactly what I'd imagined, but seeing Wilder's originals written on Big Chief and 50/50 tablets like the ones I used at school to write book reports on and take spelling dictation, it made the act of writing a book seem real, tangible, and immediate. I had previously thought authors were like Greek gods and goddesses, living unimaginable lives of divine inspiration. It somehow hadn't occurred to me that books could have such a humble beginning, and that, at least for me, implied hard work. Books simply didn't materialize in printed form, bound and trimmed, illustrated with fascinating pictures. Real people had to sit down and write, just as I did when I wrote those book reports. Writing wasn't glamorous, it was real. Which brings me to my second revelation all those years ago, in this very kitchen. That Wilder herself seemed real. Not some kind of distant celebrity or glamorous, there's that word again, glamorous author who lived a totally different kind of life than the rest of us. She even looked a little like my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Mongar. And yet, Laura Ingalls Wilder had produced something important, something extraordinary. Laura Ingalls Wilder was at once accessible and mysterious. And from that moment on, I wanted to learn more about the creative process, how writers worked, and what inspired them. So in part, my first visit here all those years ago inspired this class. But so too did the first Wilder book I read back in the 1960s, Little Town on the Prairie, the 7th book in Wilder's series. I discovered Wilder relatively late as a 10-year-old, and by then I was much more interested in the final books in the series, when Laura was older and her future as an adult wasn't all that far away. A passage from By the Shores of Silver Lake seemed especially haunting to me when Laura and Lena discovered that a girl not much older than they had just gotten married. Laura looked at Lena, and Lena looked at her. On the way back to camp, they did not say anything for some time. Then they both spoke at once. "She was only a little older than I am," said Laura. And Lena said, "I'm a year older than she was." Then Lena tossed her curly black head. "She's a silly. Now she can't ever have any more good times." This is an older Laura, a sometimes more somber Laura, and the young reader in me recognized and responded to her. I suspect that my positive associations with Wilder's final books may have triggered my own interest in writing for young adults, all those years later, and why I continue to find Wilder's last books in the series so critically and emotionally satisfying. The style and tone of Wilder's last books further set them apart from Wilder's earlier novels: Little House in the Big Woods, published in 1932, Farmer Boy, published in 1933, Little House on the Prairie, published in 1935, and On the Banks of Plum Creek, published in 1937. These books are considered middle grade novels, are books written for young readers ages 8 to 10. Part 1 of this class included a detailed examination of middle grade books, and I encourage you all to review that lecture to get a better understanding of children's literature and the contrast between Wilder's early books and her later ones. In fact, all the lectures from Part 1 are currently available through the class website, so feel free to backtrack anytime to gain more perspective on the material we explored in that earlier class. But first, a quick overview to put Wilder and her work into perspective before we dive into her later books and the young adult category. Laura Ingalls Wilder began writing professionally in 1911 as a columnist and eventually an editor for the Missouri Ruralist, the largest agricultural newspaper in the state in the early 20th century. Wilder and her husband Almanzo had moved to Missouri from South Dakota with their daughter Rose in 1894. The couple bought a farm near Mansfield in the Missouri Ozarks, and over the years added to their property, planted an apple orchard, built a unique farmhouse using primarily materials from the land itself, and established a small but very successful farm. Wilder wrote on a variety of subjects for the Ruralist, appealing primarily to the publication's women readers, although she frequently developed stories that appealed to men as well, on farming innovations and management, the Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915, and current events. She also began to write about her childhood on the American frontier, the hard winter of 1880-1881, teaching school at the age of 16, Friday night literaries in the small town of DeSmet, Dakota Territory. Wilder became such a popular contributor to the Missouri Ruralist that the newspaper published a short profile about her in 1918. Her editor explained, "She knows farm folks and their problems as few women who write know them, and having sympathy with the folks whom she serves, she writes well." Wilder continued to write for the Ruralist until the mid-1920s. Meanwhile, Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, had successfully launched a writing career of her own at roughly the same time, working as a reporter on newspapers in Kansas City, then moving on to San Francisco with her husband, Gillette, where she landed a job with the San Francisco Bulletin. Lane quickly transitioned into writing for what she called the big markets, for such prominent magazines as Sunset and Ladies' Home Journal. And she set out to teach her mother how to write for these big markets, although Lane herself hadn't been writing professionally much longer than Wilder. As Lane wrote to her mother, "What I am trying to do is to give you the benefit of these 10 years of work and study. I'm trying to train you as a writer for the big market." The two women forged a tight editorial alliance as Lane's career blossomed. During the 1920s, Lane began writing short fiction, published several books, and became one of the best-selling women writers to emerge from this period. She also edited 3 magazine articles for her mother, produced for McCall's and Country Gentleman magazines. Wilder was sometimes uneasy about the aggressive editorial style her daughter applied to these articles, and Lane responded to her mother's concerns this way: "Don't be absurd about my doing the work on your article. I didn't rewrite a bit more than I rewrite Mary Heaton Vorse's articles or Inez Haynes Irwin's stories. Lane's editorial comments and suggestions may have sometimes been difficult to accept, but by the end of the 1920s, Wilder had apparently grown to trust her daughter's editorial instincts completely. By then, Lane had divorced her husband and was living back at Rocky Ridge Farm in the Ozarks. With the earnings from her own writing career, she built her parents a retirement home on the farm. This is the Rock House. And Lane had made improvements to the farmhouse here, which she shared with her companion, Helen Boylston. But Wilder herself wasn't quite ready for retirement, and by the spring of 1930 had completed her first book-length manuscript, an autobiographical narrative of her childhood and adolescence on the American frontier. In May 1930, Wilder presented the rough draft to Lane, hoping she would edit the manuscript and help market it to magazine publishers. Entitled Pioneer Girl, this manuscript was written for adult readers, and although the two women worked on several different versions of this narrative, the book didn't find a home during Wilder's lifetime. One editor after another made comments on the manuscript like this one from Country Home magazine. Pioneer Girl contains some interesting pioneer reminiscences, but Country Home has no place for nonfiction serials. But in the process of revising and editing Pioneer Girl, Lane had an inspired idea to rework sections of the manuscript from Wilder's childhood in Wisconsin as a book for children. The transition involved not only a shift in audience from adult readers to children, but a shift in genre from nonfiction to fiction. This juvenile version of Pioneer Girl quickly gained traction and went on to become Wilder's first novel, Little House in the Big Woods, published in 1932. As for Pioneer Girl, Wilder and Lane abandoned attempts to publish it in the early 1930s, but Wilder used it as a foundation for all but one of the Little House books that were published in her lifetime. And as we'll see later in the class, Lane used Pioneer Girl as well for two of her own novels, including Let the Hurricane Roar, also published in 1932. A creative decision that could have had dire consequences for both women. Wilder and Lane's editorial collaboration continued into the 1930s, changing and evolving as Wilder gained more confidence and skill as a novelist, a subject we'll examine later in the class. And we'll see by this time, Wilder didn't always accept her daughter's editorial counsel at face value. Here, for example, in a discussion about the landscape in Wilder's novel On the Banks of Plum Creek, Wilder wrote Lane, "Get these Ozark Hills and our gorge at Rocky Ridge Farm out of your mind. The character of the place at Plum Creek was altogether different." By this time, Lane had left Rocky Ridge Farm, and the Wilders had moved back into the farmhouse here at Rocky Ridge. So, the scene is set for part 2 of this course. Wilder and Lane are still collaborating as author and editor, but now living in different parts of the country, and launching, at Wilder's insistence, into an experiment in writing for young readers, moving into the great unknown of creating fiction for young adults in the late 1930s.